très compliqué.
Money.
Gros stress.
Non représentative.
Compliqué.
Spectacle.
Spectacle.
Absurde.
Opaque.
Old school.
Achat.
Big data.
Télé-réalité.
What the fudge? France! All right, the presidential election of America is officially next week, and I hope all of the USA Francophiles out there watching this video have or will be exercising their right to vote. Now, we just heard what some Frenchies think when the word American election is brought up. So today's video is going to talk about the differences between the French and US way of electing a president that makes the French people say, America, you be cray-cray. Now, in a 7-minute video, I cannot get through all the major points, so I picked the ones I thought were the most important, but obviously in the comments below, let me know what you thought, any major things you think I missed, and of course, which system do you prefer? Keeping in mind that no one's perfect. So, slap on your fancy beret, grab your glass of vino, c'est parti! Okay, first things first, when it comes to campaigning to be president of the United States or of France, the timing between the two countries of the actual campaigning before election is really different. It is so much longer in the US than it is in France. It's almost 3 times longer. In the US, the president the candidate tends to campaign a year before the actual election date. In France, it's like 4 months. So they elect their president in May. You really start the campaigning in January. Now, why is it so much shorter? One of the main reasons is that in France, they didn't until recently have primaries. And so that does cut some time off of the campaign trail. But the most important thing just to keep in mind is when you have a shorter campaign race, that means that there is less opportunities to have your entire news feed, your radio stations, your commercial breaks, just like your entire freaking life taken over by the election. So the motto in France is a bit more short and sweet. But in France, it's also not about taking over every single communication channel that you ever did come across, because in France, all French candidates have to have equal time. Yes, you heard me right. Equal screen time, equal air time, equal face time, 100% equal, and it's highly regulated. Imagine a campaign in the US where candidates weren't buying billboards to bash their opponents because it's illegal. Where every commercial break wasn't an opportunity to shove their policies down your throat because it's illegal. Or even, for example, imagine a Fox News where every time they invited the conservative candidate to come and speak, they legally had to invite the liberal one as well for the same amount of time. But bienvenue en France. So you can understand that it's so much more regulated in France that it's hard for them to not only understand the length of the campaign, but also just the onslaught of information being thrown our way in the US. Now, this is not to say that there's not a lot of campaigning going on when you're voting for president in France. However, it's less intrusive. I really feel like you have to go out and be in search of that information and want to educate yourself more. Whereas in the US, if you just sit back and live your normal life, there's no way that you can stay away from being bombarded by info. Okay, we cannot get through a French-American video without talking about the topic of money. Both countries are highly regulated when it comes to raising money, donations, how they're spending on the campaign trail, etc. However, The spending in the US is astronomical when you compare it with France. In 2016, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent over $1.2 billion combined while campaigning to be the next president. When you look at France at the same time, François Fillon and Emmanuel Macron spent $39 million campaigning. I mean, it's not cheap change here, but there's kind of a big difference when you look at both countries. Spending is hardcore capped in France when it comes to the election. The French would never want to feel like a candidate potentially bought the election, or even worse, that rich donors could potentially influence the next president. Now, while a lot of polls have shown that more and more Americans want to see reforms when it comes to campaign spending, the French still tend to have a relationship that's a little bit different with wealth and politics than Americans do. In France, being wealthy and running for president is not seen as a positive thing at all. It's seen as like you can't relate to most of the population. And so Macron, for example, when he was running for president, his big scandal wasn't the fact that his wife used to be his teacher and she's way older than him. It was the fact that he had previously worked at a bank. You take the US, for example, and our current president is very, very wealthy and comes from a very wealthy family. So the French just tend to be really suspicious about an abundance of wealth, whether it comes to the amount that their president has or how much they've been spending during the campaign. When it comes to actual candidates, there are some similarities in the US and France because both countries have been dominated by two very strong political parties. In the US, you've had the Democrats and the Republicans, and there's no president since the 1850s that wasn't representing one of these two parties in the US. France was living a really similar reality as well, with the Socialist Party and the right wing who changed their name every 5 days, so I don't even know what to call them, until Emmanuel Macron created his own party and was elected. The French system is set up so that a lot of candidates can get enough signatures to be on the ballot. So when the French go to vote, often they can have, say, 10 candidates to choose from. Each candidate is hoping to secure more than 50% of the vote to win the presidency. But because there are so many candidates with similar policies, nobody has ever secured 50% of the vote. And so then the French have to vote a second time with the top 2 candidates. What this boils down to in France really is that there's more opportunity for people coming from less known parties to get the same amount of screen time, the same amount of airtime, the same amount of time to debate their policies and present their ideas. And we know how much the French love to debate. And we can see that the system is set up today where someone like President Macron can create his own party and win the election. I don't know if that could honestly happen in the US. So it does surprise the French that the way that we're set up with primaries and very large campaign budgets, that we're not really giving an opportunity for parties that are maybe not represented enough today, but maybe because they just haven't gotten their message out far enough. One of my all-time favorite parts about French politics is the fact that candidates will run multiple times. Yes, you heard me right. If you lose the presidency in France, that does not mean that you cannot run again. In the US, if you lose, it's done. Forever. If you think Mitt Romney, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, when they campaigned to be president and lost, done. If you didn't win the confidence of the American people in 1990, your party is definitely not taking a chance on you in 2020. When you're in France watching a presidential debate, commenting on everybody like it's The Bachelor on steroids, you could seriously be watching the same woman who's been running for president for the last 25 years. I am not kidding. Look this up. Every French election does not have a new face with a new plan. Often it's friendly faces with the same agenda, pushing the same idea. Absolutely cannot talk about the French and American election process without discussing indirect and direct suffrage. The thing is, in France, each vote counts. It's as simple as that. You go to the voting booth, you vote, and the candidate who has the most amount of votes wins. In the US, we like to make things confusing AF because the US citizens don't actually vote directly for their president. They're voting for representatives to be sent to the Electoral College, and then it's actually the Electoral College that elects the presidency. So to make it simple, we have had in the most recent years quite a bit of presidents that won the popular vote but didn't win in the Electoral College, and therefore they didn't win the presidency. So the French totally understand that the system was put in place at a time when it served a purpose to help the interests of states with smaller populations, but today they think it's kind of whack. They're like, okay, you've got way too many times where the popular person has not actually won the presidency, so why have you guys not made some amendments to this really outdated system? And I'm like, I don't know. Alright guys, that is a wrap for this video. I will see you all in the comments below. I know you will have lots to say. See you next week.